Isn't it strange that modern Stoicism today, both in writing and in online content, only looks at Stoic ethics and doesn't care to explain to its audience an enormous chunk of Stoic philosophy, their physics and their logic? We find this myopic focus on Stoic ethics quite a desperate situation. It's like instead of exploring a garden full of colorful plants and exotic fruits, I made you stay in your room and just gave you an apple and said, "Here man, eat this, stop complaining. You won't really want to explore the garden anyway. This is what you actually want." To remedy this short-sightedness of today's modern Stoicism, we're going to help you guys build a more unified and more complementary understanding of Stoic philosophy by exploring the whole garden. That is, by exploring Stoic philosophy as a whole, and not just in part. This is one of the channel's main aims. In today's video, we're going to introduce you to the topic of Stoic tripartition, or their threefold division of philosophy into physics, logic, and ethics. So this video is going to be a journey, and we're eventually going to get back to how tripartition can apply to your guys' study with Stoicism. But first we're going to do a little bit of a detour and talk about some of the scholarship, which is really interesting, as you'll see. The Stoics came up with some pretty beautiful analogies for their tripartition of philosophy. 3 analogies, in fact, which are mentioned by Diogenes Laertius. The first analogy the Stoics came up with for tripartition is that philosophy is like an egg. Logic is the egg shell, ethics is the egg white, and physics the yolk. Their that was weird. Okay. Bit of a disco. Their second analogy compares philosophy to an organism, or a living creature. Logic is the creature's bones and sinews, ethics its flesh, and physics is the creature's soul. And you know how a moment ago I said that modern Stoicism is just giving you a piece of fruit and not exploring the whole garden? I was referring to the Stoics' third analogy, which has it that philosophy is like a garden. Logic is the garden's surrounding fence. Physics is the soil and the plants in the garden, and ethics the fruit. With modern Stoicism, you're just getting an apple. With Stoicism in color, you'll get the whole garden. In Ryan Holiday's book, The Daily Stoic, only the garden analogy is mentioned. But actually, one of the main Stoics criticized the garden analogy as misleading. The Stoic philosopher and polymath Posidonius, one of the most famous Stoics in ancient times, the last undisputed scholar of the Stoic school in Athens, who did much to popularize Stoicism in Rome and influence people like Cicero, preferred the living being analogy of tripartition to the garden analogy. Now, we might think this is a kind of boring detail that we don't need to really consider, but I think it shows something more. I think that Posidonius's preference, and some scholars also think this, may be taken to indicate a fundamental idea in the Stoic tripartition of philosophy, that these 3 parts are not just connected, but they are tightly interrelated and woven together, just like the bones, sinews, flesh, and soul of a living being. After all, harvesting the fruit from a garden doesn't affect the whole garden as radically as removing the bones or flesh from a living being does. I mean, I couldn't remove my flesh or my soul without radically changing, or indeed destroying, myself as a living being. So the living being analogy shows better than the garden analogy that the 3 parts of philosophy for the Stoics are not independent parts, things that are separable and that can stand alone, but instead that these are interdependent parts of the living being or of philosophy, each part playing a crucial role in sustaining and unifying the whole. And by analogy, logic, physics, and ethics are parts of philosophy in this sense, this strong sense. So the Stoics had a very strong criteria for what counts as a part, and they gave a very lofty status to something that meets these criteria and thus qualifies as a part. Okay?
Agreed.
Okay. Side note, The study of parts and wholes is what today we call mereology. It was a major topic in philosophy in antiquity, and to this day it is still a major topic in contemporary philosophy, mereology. But let's not get stuck on that, let's get back to the Stoics. In all three of the Stoics' analogies, the egg, the living being, and the garden, we see that logic is the outermost supporting element, that it has a structural role. This reflects the consensus in Stoic philosophy that logic is what holds philosophy together, marks its limits, and gives it a structure and a cohesion. Let's get back to tripartition. The Stoics actually had quite a bit to say about it, not only about the division into three parts, but also, as our sources tell us, about the order of presenting the three parts to their students in their teaching program. And yet, as is almost always the case with Stoicism, these texts do not survive, and we just have their titles. And the textual evidence for what the Stoics actually said about the tripartition of philosophy is pretty scant, and mostly comes from ancient commentaries like Diogenes Laertius, who was a doxographer, or Sextus Empiricus, a skeptic, or Plutarch, a Platonist.
What is a doxographer?
Doxographer is somebody who reports on the doctrines, the doxa, of the philosophers who came before them. And that's what Diogenes Laertius did. It makes for a nice reading. It's kind of like journalism a little bit, like we're sort of getting an insight into what these people did. He also talks about their lives, their biographies, but it's not critically engaging with the arguments. There are quite a few articles in the contemporary scholarship devoted to this topic of tripartition. Quite difficult articles, I would say. Pierre Hadot, Katerina Irodiaconou, Julia Annas, Christopher Gill, and Ada Bronowski. What these scholars make clear is that the Stoics strongly believed that a student of Stoicism actually cannot understand ethics without understanding at least the basics of logic and physics. All the scholars say this. Now, this is because at any given part of Stoic philosophy, being a part in a strong sense, as we've seen, is mutually illuminating of the other two parts. So Julia Annas writes, for example, that becoming a Stoic requires more than mastering the ethical part. Stoic philosophy consists of all three parts strongly unified into a whole. The person who has studied ethics needs to go on not only to study the other two parts, but to integrate their results with ethics to produce a unified understanding from all three perspectives. On this channel, we're going to explore Stoic physics and logic, which will help you guys to do exactly that, to develop your own unified understanding of Stoicism, and to deepen your own Stoic practice. Now, just what exactly are the Stoics dividing into three parts? According to one of our main sources, again Diogenes Laertius, the Stoics debated this question amongst themselves. We read from Diogenes that some of them didn't divide philosophy, philosophia, but the kata philosophian logon, which is often translated as the discourse about philosophy, but a better translation, I think, would be the account corresponding to philosophy, as the scholar Ada Bronowski argues. On the other hand, certain Stoics, like Zeno of Tarsus, did the reverse, dividing philosophy and not the account corresponding to philosophy. Now, I know what you might be thinking. What does this mean? What is the difference anyway, and why should we care about it? Why does it matter? Let's think about this. If the Stoics divided the account corresponding to philosophy, or kata philosophian logon, we might think that they're dividing their teaching curriculum. So in that case, partitioning was just a kind of pedagogical or classroom-based decision, meaning that logic, physics, and ethics were separate ways of analyzing or talking about one and the same thing, namely philosophy, and that the student would be taught these ways separately. So this is quite a popular view among scholars, And according to it, the Stoic tripartition is based on a separation between the kind of analysis of something, for instance, logical, physical, or ethical analysis, and that's different from the object of analysis, or the thing that is being analyzed, namely philosophy. Let's make this clearer with an example. Let's take a tree as our object of analysis. Now, we might think of logic, physics, and ethics as different ways of analyzing the tree, or different ways of arriving at knowledge of the tree. So a logical analysis of the tree might run like this. We'd form a proposition. This is a tree. This thing is a tree. Next, we might combine this with another one to form a conditional or an if statement, which we find in computer programming. So we might say, if this is a tree, then it yields lumber. So this statement asserts a claim that is true or false. It also adds to our knowledge by asserting a relation of necessity. In other words, if this thing is a tree, it necessarily must be true and cannot be false that it yields timber. A physical analysis of the tree would proceed differently, of course. It might ask, what is the tree made of? How does it grow? How does it fit into the order of the cosmos? A Stoic ethical analysis would also proceed differently. And it might ask, what role does the tree play in human life? Is it to be used, protected, revered? What is its role in relation to the good life? So as these examples show, we're studying one unified object in three different ways. What gets divided is not the object, not the tree. We don't cut the tree up into bits, but rather what gets divided is the discourse about the object or the tree. Similarly, then, Stoic tripartition is not a division of philosophy into three, but a division of the way of teaching philosophy into three. This being what the student of Stoicism would have to learn in order to actually do one thing, namely philosophy. This understanding of Stoic partitioning is fairly intuitive. Scholars like Pierre Hadot think that this is how Stoic tripartition worked. Hadot draws from Plutarch to say that Stoicism separated their theoretical teaching of logic, physics, and ethics from the practice of philosophy as a way of life, or a unified practice of living wisely. Hadot sees the Stoic partition as only a tool for teaching theory, while philosophy itself remained unified as a lived pursuit. Now, the problem with this view of Hadot's is that it appears to make the account corresponding to philosophy, that thing that gets divided up into three parts, a domain in and of itself separate from philosophy proper. The scholar Ancient
I'm a scholar, my name's Ancient, and you better deal with it.
Okay.
Immediate props as a scholar if you're called Ancient.
Last name Stoicism. This problem has been pointed out by another Stoic scholar, Bronowski. Bronowski demonstrates that this distinction between philosophy and the account corresponding to philosophy, what we've been talking about, is not really the central issue in Stoic partition. She also criticizes Hadot's sharp separation between theory and practice, and his view that tripartition applies only to theory. Bronowski shows that the Stoics did not actually make the theory-practice distinction, and that Hadot kind of over-projects this distinction onto the Stoics. So the projection of the theory-practice distinction is a problem, because it artificially separates theory and practice into two independent and separable domains. Bronowski points to Stoic sources that show that the Stoics did not see theory and practice as two separate domains, which are then unified in a second step. Rather, they are unified to begin with, and only later they are seen as separate for the sake of convenience, for teaching So Hadot's error is to see this second step as the first step. So let's make this a bit clearer, give you guys some examples that will help you in your own Stoic practice.
How deep are we going into this shit? Don't worry.
Don't worry.
We'll get
It's
there.
interesting.
It's interesting.
Bronowski points out that the early Stoics, like Chrysippus, the third scholar of the Stoic school, spoke of three kinds of principles: the logical, the physical, and the ethical kind of principles. And these correspond to the three parts of philosophy that we've been talking about. What's really interesting about Bronowski's reading of Stoic tripartition is that Stoics like Chrysippus saw tripartition itself as neither fundamental doctrine nor as a rigid pedagogical rule, but rather as ultimately dispensable in face of philosophy's greater goal. So it's like something that becomes trivialized to a point. What really counts is solving philosophical problems, like understanding how to live or the physical basis of reality. And engaging in these problems invariably spans all three domains of philosophy. The most important questions of philosophy turn out to be rooted in all the parts. So actually, tripartition is a kind of conventional framework, but nothing hangs on it or hinges on it when one is actually doing philosophy. So Bronowski helps us to see from this kind of approach to teaching the way that the Stoics taught their philosophy allowed for a kind of fluidity. So the order of learning was not something fixed, because this was actually how Plato and the Platonists after him conceived of education. The student in Plato's school has to be formed correctly before being able to do philosophy, before being able to engage in dialectic. So the Stoics were not Platonists in this sense. They rejected this kind of formative approach to education, and they focused much more on content and on the relationship between different kinds of principles in philosophy. So, for the Stoics, the student can make modest progress in ethics, in one topic, by relying on partial knowledge from other topics. So sometimes you have to assume a principle from one part to make headway in another part, and then circle back. So if you guys were to apply this principle to your journey with Stoicism, let's say you're just starting out and you're reading Marcus Aurelius, and you come across something he says that you don't understand, that is about, say, God, or about physics, or something that you haven't really read up on. That is not a problem. You can keep reading. Don't get stuck thinking that I don't know this, I can't continue, I'm not good at philosophy, I'm never going to be good at it, or something like that. You can just keep going. Let it wash over you. Try and follow the arguments, and then pick out those things in the text that you didn't understand, and go to, let's say, a compendium of Stoic philosophy, like the one by Long and Sedley, or this channel, for example, where we explain Stoic terms and concepts. And that way you will deepen your understanding without feeling like you are not able to read a text, or you're not able to progress. So I think this is a very kind of human approach to learning. You don't need to be formed as an amazing thinker before being able to do Stoic philosophy. So, thanks to her work on how the Stoics viewed education, Bronowski shows us that it's one continuous practice of cultivating one's own rational orientation with the world. Okay, I'm going to explain this a little bit simpler, because that sounded quite theoretical. Each part of philosophy, logic, ethics, physics, is a particular mode of this cultivation of the student's reason. So, whether you're looking at your emotions, or investigating the life of trees, or being engaged in dialectic, or giving a talk, These are all instances of using and sharpening our reason, using our logical, ethical, and physical lenses that Stoic philosophy gives us as a way to see and engage with reality. By cultivating these three perspectives that we view reality with the help of Stoic philosophy, we advance towards virtue. Chrysippus, one of the greatest Stoics to have ever lived, highlights the fundamental need for living and learning by making mistakes, and that making mistakes is a fundamental part of philosophizing. Chrysippus says, quote, "It is not possible to philosophize if we are not living, nor can we become wise if we do not spend a great deal of our lives living badly and in ignorance." Chrysippus' statement here shows that the Stoics viewed philosophizing as an experiential, progressive, lifelong endeavor. No one can reach wisdom, for the Stoics, without the trial and error of everyday life. Philosophy is an ongoing exercise or practice of aligning oneself with the divine logos, or rational structure of reality, by improving our vision through one of these three kinds of glasses. This way, the Stoics recalibrate philosophy away from being purely theoretical or simply a state of mind or massive accumulation of theoretical knowledge, and rather towards philosophy being the continual cultivation of one's logical, ethical, and physical perspectives, always keeping the final goal of wisdom, the completely clear tripartite outlook on reality that the sage possesses, firmly in view. As Voltaire puts it at the end of Candide, Stoic philosophy is about cultivating one's garden. It's about making sure the border fence is solid and secure with logic, the ground and the plants are lush and well watered with physics, and that there are a diversity, not just of apples or pears, but of all kinds of fruit, the fruits of ethics.